40 years ago this past week, I was here at the 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant when it suffered a near meltdown, terrifying the entire nation. This morning, I revisit the site of the worst nuclear accident in U.S. history.
Now, from 42nd and 2nd, this is Pix 11 News Close-Up with Marvin Scott.
Good morning. 40 years after the nation held its breath over the near meltdown of this 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant, many of the circumstances surrounding the accident remain cloaked in mystery. Just how much radiation was released, and why can't anyone say for certain that the accident caused many illnesses, including cancer? I was here back in 1979, and now I've returned looking for answers.
3 Mile Island is a nightmare in which we haven't woken up from.
The nightmare began in the early hours of March 28, 1979. 3 Mile Island was working like a giant tea kettle, making steam for electricity from the No. 2 nuclear reactor. A bulky valve shut down 2 pumps, leaving tons of radioactive uranium sizzling. Workers didn't notice thousands of gallons of cooling water being drained from the reactor. Radiation leaked into the air. Despite a partial meltdown, plant officials were quick to reassure the public there was no cause for alarm.
I wouldn't call it at this point a very serious accident. No, very small traces of radioactivity have been released from the plant.
The Nuclear Regulatory Commission quickly backed up that assertion, but 40 years later there remain billowing clouds of doubt.
First, there was no real problem. Then there might be a problem. Then there's a small problem. And then there was a hydrogen bubble, and then there wasn't a hydrogen bubble.
It was significantly worse than what was communicated at the time of the accident. They were misleading the public. We had an accident in which 40% of the core melted. We had temperatures that almost hit 5,000 degrees.
They lied, and they still lie.
The NRC told me, quote at this meeting, the radiation that your child got was like having a glass of wine or smoking a cigarette.
We felt betrayed that we were not being given answers. What threats we now faced.
The facility itself is located midstream in the river, about 10 miles southwest of Pennsylvania's capital of Harrisburg.
Traces of radiation were detected as far as 10 miles from the nuclear plant. Government and plant officials insisted they were at such low levels there were negligible effects on health and the environment. And to this day, they deny there were any deaths or serious illnesses as a result of the accident.
There is no debate. The evidence is clear. Every study that's been conducted has found elevated levels of cancer caused by radiation exposure. What's in question is whether or not 3 Mile Island was the causal agent.
A University of North Carolina study found that cancer and leukemia rates were 2 to 10 times higher for those who lived near the plant at the time of the accident. Though they continue to deny responsibility for the health effects, the plant owners paid out $80 million in health and other claims, including more than $1 million for a child born with Down syndrome. In a more recent study, the Penn State College of Medicine researchers have shown for the first time a possible link between the accident and thyroid cancers.
We found molecular changes indicative of exposure to radiation in people who were in the vicinity during the accident. What our findings suggest is that the exposure to radiation after the 3 Mile Island accident may have caused a health effect.
Why can't you say this is conclusive evidence?
Suggestive.
Dr. Goldenberg says his study dealt with a small sample of cases, and he's currently planning a much more extensive study. Veterinarians reported a marked increase in adverse health effects among animals within a 15-mile radius of TMI, and a number of plants as well exhibited strange mutations. Amid all the reports of adverse health effects, I met this man in 1984 who believed he benefited from the radiation.
Arthritis, gone. Radiation treatments they give you for arthritis, you know. I got mine free.
Across the road from TMI, the state has placed a historical marker noting what happened here 4 decades ago. It's different from the one angry residents put up but was taken down. What does this say that doesn't?
The official sign never mentions the word meltdown. The citizen sign mentions the word meltdown because that is what happened here, and that's what the utility and the state want people to forget.
They're evacuated in a 5-mile radius.
As fear mounted, 140,000 people evacuated the area, and within 5 years of the accident, more than 50% of the people living near the plant moved out. In recent years, many others have settled here. The crippled reactor has been dormant since the accident, and unless they get a government bailout, the operators intend to shut the plant down in September. With more than 800 tons of radioactive nuclear waste still at the site, residents living in the shadow of the plant are concerned.
Very concerned because 40 years later, no one has gone into the basement of where that accident was. No one has cleaned up that accident.
Do you fear this could happen again?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's all about greed, money, not the safety of the people.
Even if this plant shuts down as is currently planned in September and the island is abandoned, it will still leave behind massive amounts of radioactive nuclear waste, furthering the anxieties of the people who live near this plant. For those who believe nuclear power is the energy source for the future, they view plants such as this simply as another minefield in a world crowded with environmental hazards. When we come back, we'll explore the future of nuclear power plants. Stay with us as Pix 11 News Close-Up continues. The 3 Mile Island accident was a wake-up call and an expensive learning opportunity for both the nuclear industry and society as well. Here in the United States, it took almost 40 years to finally begin building new nuclear power plants. 2 of them are currently in construction. At the moment, there are about 60 in operation, including Indian Point here in New York. So, what did we learn from the worst nuclear accident in U.S. history? And what is the future of nuclear energy in the age of global warming? Here to explore that, I'm prepared to have with us 2 distinguished guests. Carl Rabogo, the Executive Director of the Pace Energy and Climate Center at the Pace Law School in White Plains, and Peter Wolf, an attorney who specializes in environmental law, and he also has a company, the company which is named Nuclear Solutions, Nuclear Energy Solutions. Gentlemen, thanks so much for coming in. I want to pick up on something I said in that report, that over $1 billion has been spent on the cleanup since 1979, yet there are many tons of nuclear waste still in those in the basement of those reactors. Why is that, Peter? You're the expert.
Well, one of the reasons is it's very difficult to get to it. It is true in other sites as well. In Chernobyl, which occurred in 1986, about 18 months ago, they put in a $2 billion sarcophagus, part of which had robotics to try to deal with the nuclear waste there. And Fukushima is still leaking some 8 years later. So it's very difficult to deal with nuclear waste.
So do the people living there, they still have reason to be concerned 40 years later?
Well, yeah, there's indication that there's radiation that's still going to the populations surrounding that. And there's statistics about Indian Point as well, that there seem to be higher levels of radiation among the residents right around Indian Point than elsewhere.
Now, Peter, when you have all this radiation there, the government, the NRC, and the officials from the utility, they say that the leakage was minimal. Do you agree with that? I know there were 2-foot thick walls at that reactor, and they say there was a minimal leakage of radiation.
From my review of the studies, there seems to be some disagreement about that. The official reports say that there was minimal leakage. They used analogies like the equivalent of exposure to a chest x-ray, and that it was less than that. There were some kinds of radiation, like the beta radiation, that were left out of the government reports. There were subsequent analyses that suggested that that radiation exposure may have been much higher. And unfortunately, the truth is we probably will never know a reliable truth. There's huge uncertainty, and of course those releases were into the atmosphere. So wind blows, rain falls, things move around. Every day that goes by, it becomes even more and more impossible to tell where and what happened.
So do you believe there was a greater leakage than we've been told?
Well, yes. I mean, the good news is that that the accident was contained. That was the good news, but the bad news is that there certainly was an incident. It was in the reports that came out some years later was much more serious than originally thought. It was interesting because at the time, and I understand that you were there at the time, but President Carter came and he had 2 nuclear experts with him, and they were debating at that point as to what the danger was with regard to the hydrogen bubble and whether that was going to be an imminent blow-off. So there was quite a bit of controversy about that.
Carl, I believe I've seen you quoted as saying that the still details of that accident are still not clear 40 years later. Why not?
I think part of it is that they weren't prepared to be able to measure the amounts of radiation. Each nuclear plant is different, each incident is different, and I think that they probably were not able to get a comprehensive picture of exactly what happened.
I think you need to also add that the nuclear industry was born in a culture of secrecy. A lot of what they were doing was confidential. It was a weapon developed for wartime. The research was originally all dedicated to that. The engineers that came to the peaceful atom process and projects came from the military side. So there is a culture of keeping things quiet and a little bit of sort of an attitude of hubris that ordinary people don't have the tools to understand it, that's carried over into the nuclear power industry.
Now, let me ask both of you. There's still so much debate over whether or not that accident was the cause of so many illnesses in that region. An uptick in thyroid cancers, right, and also other illnesses. One child born with Down syndrome, to which the utility paid out $1 million. What do you have to say about?
As a lawyer, you know, we should not, I would say, I'd caution not to confuse litigation outcomes with truth, right? How lawyers settle questions does not necessarily reflect the facts as much as it reflects the litigation position and the perceptions of risk. I think the big takeaway is that in our environments today, we are exposed to a wide range of challenges to our health and to our environment. This added to them. There's no doubt about that. So the question is, did the additional radiation from that did happen from 3 Mile Island put somebody over the edge and get them to the point where they developed a disease or where a genetic mutation did occur? Probably going to be impossible to go all the way back on that road and figure it out, but there's no doubt that the cumulative effects are that some people suffered more, and this was in the mix.
Now, the Centers for Disease Control say that Pennsylvania has the highest level of thyroid cancers in the country, whether you have a nuclear plant there or not. But the people who live there, they attribute it to 3 Mile Island and that accident and the leakage of radiation. What do you think, Carl?
Well, I think that thyroid cancer is the big indicator. For example, even around here we have Indian Point, and there was at one time they were distributing the iodide tablets to counteract the possibility of thyroid cancer should there be an accident at Indian Point. What was significant is that I believe at the same time that they were distributing these potassium iodide tablets on a 20-mile radius, the evacuation plan at that point in time for Indian Point was only 10 miles. So clearly there is a link between radiation and thyroid cancer.
What have we learned in the 40 years since the accident?
Oh boy,
Well, one thing that we've learned is that we want to try to prevent another accident from occurring. We need to do everything possible to prevent an accident from recurring. And Chernobyl is obviously the poster child
Fukushima
for that.
as well, right?
But Fukushima, with the Japanese unable to really contain that many, many years later, and by the way, that was not contained. They do not know how much radiation actually went into the atmosphere. They don't know how much is remaining because there the containment vessel went.
Yeah, and I was going to also say that I think we learned that when you mix humans and very large machines, you increase the opportunity for accidents. This accident happened because of human reactions to breaks, little flaws in the machine, valves that did not work, and how people responded to that. You know, the story goes back that the 3 Mile Island accident didn't really get controlled until the shift changed, because the people that had been staring at the gauges and responding to the problem had in their mind a fixed set of assumptions about what was going on. And until fresh minds came in, they didn't actually even see what was happening. Browns Ferry had had almost exactly the same accident months before, but they responded in a matter of minutes. It took hours at 3 Mile Island. So the human-machine interface, we've gotten better. We've got more technology that improves that, but it's still a critical factor when you've got a technology this big and this complex.
We have to take a break. When we come back, I want to find out what has changed since then and what is the future of nuclear energy. Stay with us as Pix 11 News Close-Up continues. Back now with Carl Robigo and Peter Wolf. Carl is with the PACE Energy and Climate Center, and Peter has a Nuclear Energy Solutions Company, and we're talking about 40 years after the 3 Mile Island worst nuclear accident in U.S. history. Gentlemen, could it happen again?
Absolutely. And the problem is that as these plants are aging, a lot of them were originally designed with a 40-year life. So a lot of them now have gotten extensions, but we really don't know to what degree the plant integrity is still viable, and we don't know what the effects are of having power plants that are more than 40 years old.
But I was talking about that human-machine interaction before. Here's another challenging issue with our existing fleet of nuclear power plants. While nobody would, you know, overtly say, I'm going to cut corners in order to keep the plant operating, the operating nuclear power plants in this country are having a tough time. They're very expensive to run, and their electricity is very expensive, and it can't compete well in competitive markets.
Unprofitable, and the rates are going up.
So the pressure is really, really high to keep those plants running. The kind of circumstances that lead people to cut corners if they don't have integrity. And that adds a concern.
Now, we have a number of those plants are retiring in the next couple of years.
That's correct.
Governor Cuomo has decided to keep open the Indian Point plant, which actually has two reactors, doesn't it?
He has two reactors, but the Indian Point plant is scheduled to close. One of the reactors is scheduled to close next year, 2020, the other one in 2021. What he's keeping open are the 4 nuclear plants upstate. And by the way, in this area, Oyster Creek has just stopped operations in the last few months, so that's about to be decommissioned.
You support the idea of closing Indian Point? Is that a good idea?
I do. I think it is. It's too close to the population center here, and there's no viable escape plan. I was actually a Coast Guard officer and was in charge of doing emergency response, and it would be virtually impossible to evacuate this area should there be a mishap at Indian Point. And there are 20 million people living in a 50-mile radius of Indian Point.
Under any honest assessment of the risk associated with a nuclear plant so close to so many people, you wouldn't have put it there in the first place. Again, you would have had to have some level of hubris just to assume that it was always going to run perfectly and it would never be a risk to even make that decision. Same with 3 Mile Island.
So that begs the question, what about the future of nuclear power plants?
It's not good. Primarily because they're just not economic. We have to think in terms, in the energy business where I work, the critical issue is a topic we call opportunity cost. Like, what's the best thing you could do with the next dollar you have to spend? And one of the most expensive things you could do with your next available dollar is nuclear power. Everything else is less expensive. Gas is less expensive, wind and solar, and of course, energy efficiency. So if you want to keep your dollars, you don't waste them on the most expensive resource, and that's been the problem for nuclear power plant growth in this country.
I'd like to make a little differentiation. I think that what you need to do is to look at these nuclear power plants, these aging structures, which cannot compete currently with the price of natural gas. But I would not preclude all nuclear because there are a next generation of nuclear. And what is at at risk here is that you have, if you close all the nuclear power plants, which provide 20% of the electricity in this country, and renewables are not ready, what do you do? What I would advocate is rather than continuing to operate these aging plants, to at least explore the viability of the next generation of small nuclear power plants that can be contained and be much safer and much more efficient.
And the placement in much more rural areas, not heavily populated.
Yes.
Well, how do you respond to the people who say in this day of climate change that nuclear energy is clean energy and it's the best source of energy for the people?
Now, there's two issues to go with that. Again, first, you have to do a life cycle assessment about what goes into the mining of uranium, the construction of a nuclear power plant, and all the other things you have to do to create, to build, to get that first unit of energy out of it. Some studies have suggested that you don't win on climate when you factor all those in. That's why Peter's comment about differentiating between existing plants and new plants is so important. But the second thing is, again, if you want to tackle climate change, there are many less expensive options available. Should we do research on next generation? Well, I'm a big supporter of research. Let's learn. Maybe it'll teach us just how expensive that stuff is going to be. But should we wait on all our more cost-effective options? No, because I think there's a good chance that efficiency in renewables will win the long race. They're already winning everywhere in the country.
Going back to Indian Point, the reason that I advocate that it be closed is because I think it's too vulnerable to risks. There are different types of risks. There are natural risks. For example, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission designated Indian Point 3 as the plant most vulnerable in the country for earthquake because they were discovered after it was built that there were actually 2 fault lines. Of course, there's other types of man-made, other types of threats like man-made threats such as terrorism or even industrial sabotage.
And that is a big threat.
That is a big threat.
And plants are a target.
Yes, and it's not worth the risk to continue to operate an
even
aging...
Even a tiny risk is not worth taking if the magnitude of the harm is so immense that it could cripple an economy or affect the lives of millions. That has to factor into the calculation as well.
So if we're not using nuke, clean energy, what are the alternatives? Wind power, solar?
Yes, there's also hydro that can be brought in. And a very respected study was done by a group called Synapse Energy that showed that this area really doesn't need the power that's generated at Indian Point, certainly through 2020.
And efficiency. You know, demand for electricity has been flat in this country for several years now. It's one of the reasons why you can't afford to invest in nukes. We've shown that we can become more efficient, and I've run 3 different green buildings projects in my life, and I have never met a building, there are a few exceptions now, where you couldn't reduce the energy use in that building by 50% with a dedicated effort at prices less than the electricity you're using now, or the gas, or the oil, which even adds more to our carbon problems.
So, in conclusion, gentlemen, 40 years after the worst nuclear accident in this country, what do you see as the future for nuclear energy, nuclear power plants?
I think these current nuclear power plants need to be shut down. They need to be decommissioned properly. The decommissioning fund needs to be used properly, and then we need to deal with nuclear waste in a responsible manner.
I would say, I always get this mental image of Godzilla when I think of nuclear disasters and things. I don't think we need new dinosaurs. I think we need to exploit the traits of mammals. We need to be small, we need to be fast, and we need to be clever. We have the resources. We don't need dinosaurs to make it into the future.
Carl Robigo and Peter Wolf, thank you so much for your insight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that'll do it for our program for this week. If you have any comments or wish to see this broadcast again, log on to our website, pix11.com/newscloseup. I'm Marvin Scott. Thanks so much for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your Sunday, everyone.